In this section of Luke's Gospel, today's reading, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and is passing through Jericho. There are three stories told in this little passage of time. And today's reading is the second of three parts in that section. Just as last week we had two parables side by side that talked about the persistence of prayer and also the true nature of reflection upon oneself in the face of God in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Today we have two parables also that seem to inform one another. Our reading today is from Luke chapter 19, beginning at verse 1. So it's the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus, but it's preceded by the parable of Jesus healing a blind beggar that in Mark's Gospel is referred to as Bartimaeus. And that man sits at the side of the road, and when he hears Jesus is coming near, he says, "Jesus, Son of David, take pity on me." That phrase, "Son of David," not used anywhere else, specifically messianic. He keeps crying out. He wants to see Jesus, and he wants to see. Jesus calls him to him when he persistently carries on, and the crowd try to hush him up for the annoyance that he is. And he's brought to Jesus, and Jesus says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the man says, "I want to see again." And that tells us, of course, that once upon a time he could see. He wants his sight restored. He wants to be able to see again. And Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." And he is able to do so. He follows Jesus, giving thanks to God. So, our reading today. Jesus went on into Jericho and was passing through. There was a chief tax collector there named Zacchaeus, who was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but he was a little man, and he could not see Jesus because of the crowd. So he ran ahead of the crowd and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus, and who was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to that place, he looked up and said to Zacchaeus, "Hurry down, Zacchaeus, because I must stay in your house today." Zacchaeus hurried down and welcomed him with great joy. All the people who saw it started grumbling. "This man has gone as a guest to the home of a sinner." Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Listen, sir, I will give half my belongings to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I will pay him back 4 times as much." Jesus said to him, "Salvation has come to this house today, for this man also is a descendant of Abraham. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So Mark, with his fantastic literary flourish, tells us all we need to know. Zacchaeus is called a chief tax collector, and there isn't really a recognised role that's called that in New Testament times, but clearly elevated, a high-status tax collector, performing a duty which for his own people would have ostracised him completely, set him apart, made him the sort of person people would spit at and call bad names, because this was an oppressive role that this person was fulfilling on behalf of oppressors and also for self-worth. Jesus tells us he was not only a chief tax collector, he was rich. So he was doing rather well out of his ill-gotten gains. Beautiful phrasing. He was trying to see who Jesus was and who was passing by. So the blind man wants to see again. And he wants to see Jesus because he knows what Jesus can do for him. His faith made him well. Zacchaeus wants to see who Jesus is. And he does, from the top of a tree. A bizarre spectacle. A well-dressed person out atop a tree. Very strange. Even more strange, perhaps, that he would venture out into a large crowd of people, exuberant and excited, to see the figure who they believed to be the liberator of their nation from oppressors. and here is one of them in amongst them. So great personal risk. Total lack of self-dignity all of a sudden up a tree because he wants to see who Jesus was. Well, he does see Jesus, and Jesus sees him. Hurry down, he says. I must stay in your house today. Jesus immediately responded and welcomed Jesus, it says, with great joy. So he did see Jesus, first and foremost walking along, and then he saw who Jesus was. Man, I'm pleased to see you, he says, because of that welcome, because he has recognized something. Just as the blind man's sight is restored, so Zacchaeus is able to look at this human person of Jesus and recognize something that is there for him of great joy. We hear the stereotypical cry of the crowd who say, "Look at this man, he even eats with the sinners." And there is no response from Jesus at this time, unusually, because normally when we hear about the Pharisees or the scribes or the teachers of the law saying to Jesus, "Oh, you're associating with terrible people," Jesus himself will tell them a parable. But here the response comes from Zacchaeus, not in academic recrimination, but in a sign of self-sacrifice and offering. He sees Jesus in the physical form, recognizes who he is and the enormous privilege of being in his presence, and his response is extravagant and exuberant. He volunteers to turn his whole life on its head. He says to the crowd, "I will give half my belongings to the poor." Very generous. Juxtaposed, of course, with the parable of the rich man that we didn't hear, that happened between last week's readings and this week's readings. The man who had followed all the teachings of the law, and the only thing he needed to be set free, said Jesus, was to give away all his money. Not because being poor is the ultimate sign of spiritual purity, but to be held by money and wealth and to have that as a drawback to being able to respond to other children of God in the world with generosity and exuberance, that was what was holding him back. Too much money was what was causing him pain. So Zacchaeus says, "I will give up half my belongings to the poor." So not the whole thing, but an extraordinary action, way beyond anything that would perhaps be even thought of as needed. "And if I've cheated anyone," he said, "I will pay him back 4 times as much," which again is a tremendously extravagant version of the amount that one should pay as recorded in the books of the Old Testament. So a life completely and utterly changed. It doesn't necessarily say he's going to stop being a tax collector, but that's a bye-bye. Jesus says to him, "Salvation has come to this house today." Now, Jesus said to the blind man, "Your faith has made you well." He says to Zacchaeus, "Salvation has come to this house today." And just like the rich man, indeed it has. Because all of a sudden, what was normal life is no longer normal life. What is now the new life is one of fairness and equality, a one where love has blown its way into the dark corners of this soul and has made aware that what is important is to act with love and kindness and justly, and to respond well to others and to respect others. And that, of course, is the good news that Jesus comes to show in all of our lives. For when we meet with Jesus, and if for us in our unique and special ways we can own Jesus as our personal Saviour, Lord and King, then our response can be nothing else other than one of extravagant love to others. Just as Thomas in the upper room says, "My Lord and my God," so it is for us when we see Jesus. What was it about Zacchaeus that made him want to inquire so very much to see who Jesus was? What inkling had prompted him to go there? Well, it's in the story of every Christian disciple who's ever ended up meeting with God. It may be they wandered into church for some reason they didn't understand, that they listened to somebody who they never thought they would, that they read a book they never thought they would, whatever. There's a reason why the Spirit prompts people to say, "Why don't you? Why don't you? Why don't you?" And if we can listen to that voice and hear God's Spirit prompting us to explore, it's not about being overtly religious, but simply to see what is around us. The blind man once could see and now can't. And so, again, it is for so many of us. When we are first born, we are completely innocent and totally aware of the lovely things that happen to us. Babies will smile when they're warm and when they're into the face of their parents. Um, and it's a simple life and a simple existence, and one where you see the beauty of everything, and where a tiny, shiny object can fascinate you for hours. As we grow, our senses become richer and our sense of self becomes greater, and all our experiences just overwhelm us. And our sense of self becomes much more that little island, cut apart from other people because we know our own differences. But of course, to remain childlike is the ultimate goal here, to be in the world and see what God has done in this glorious creation, not only of creation, but of people and of the opportunities that they afford us and the glory that they can share with us and the love that we can ourselves receive and show to others. This is the wonderful calling of our lives. And so, for all of us, it's ultimately to know God in our hearts and to be so blown away by that beauty, that awe, that wonder, and that tremendous joy that is the fuel for all we do and say. And salvation comes to our house when we understand that we are loved by the God who made all things.